Welcome to the Michigan Political Science Association annual meeting and our panel on service provision in Africa. I'm Melissa Schaefer O'Connell from Lake Superior State University. I'm also a member of the MIPSA board. The Michigan Political Science Association is the oldest continuously active state organization in our discipline. This year's conference is MIPSA's 53rd and the second to be held virtually because of COVID. This panel is being recorded and will be posted on the MIPSA website at a later date. So we ask participants to keep their cameras off and encourage them to stay muted until the Q&A format. Because of some recording difficulties, we will begin the recording about one slide in and a few minutes into our first presenter. The first person presenting today was Manuel Soque from Western Michigan University, and he was presenting service provision and authoritarian resilience during the Angolan Civil War, 1992 to 2002.
National Assemblies. National Assembly. There are other scholars that argue that corruption is actually the contributing factor for authoritarian resilience. Other scholars argue that actually repression is a much more robust contributing factor to authoritarian resilience. And there are others that argue that elections through fraud is a much more contributing factor to authoritarian resilience. However, Bueno de Mesquita argues that regimes actually last longer and they are much more robust when they deliver service to the selectorate, which means that when they deliver service to the ruling coalition. However, Albertus presented a counter argument saying that, given the fact that regimes often are threatened both from above and from below, it is much more it's much more strategic to deliver services both to the elites and also to the masses. So authoritarian regimes, according to Albertus, they actually sideline non-state rivals so that they can make the people dependent on the state. And this is the theory that I'm using to test my case of Angola. So my research question is, how does a multi-party authoritarian regime remain in power in the context of civil war? This is a very interesting empirical question, given the fact that I'm actually testing the arguments that exist in the literature in a multi-party regime, because most of study on authoritarian resilience focus on single-party regime. So I'm testing this case in a multi-party regime, which is the case of Angola. And also, I'm looking at authoritarian resilience in the context of civil war. So my main argument then is that the Angolan government sidelined non-state rival actors, such as non-governmental organizations that were critical to it, and allowed provincial governments to deliver services both directly to the people in the slums and also in the urban areas to actually build legitimacy, make the people dependent on the state and remain in power. Just a little bit of background about Angola. This is an African country that was colonized by the Portuguese for 500 years. Angola received its independence in 1975, but unfortunately, given the lack of understanding between the different freedom fighter movement, the country immediately engaged into a long and devastating civil war that lasted for 27 years. So the country initially was ruled under a single-party regime for 16 years, and it has been ruled by the MPLA since independence. José Eduardo dos Santos is a fundamental figure in this process of ruling the country. So he ended up ruling the country for 38 years. So this is quite a big country. It's twice the size of Texas, 14 times the size of Portugal, and 16 times the size of France. So it's a tremendous, it's a big country. It's a very big country, there is a population of 33 million people, and just like other African countries, Angola is very diverse from an ethnic perspective and also from a religious perspective. And so in terms of commodity, we rely mostly on oil. So methodologically, I use public service provision as my independent variable. I'm actually using 5 different public policies to test my argument. One of them is housing and electricity, water, healthcare, and education. My dependent variable is authoritarian resilience. So by authoritarian resilience, I basically mean that, how the regime was able to sustain itself amid pressure to democratize and the civil war as well. This is a project that draws on 60 elite interviews in 5 different provinces of Angola, just for variation. So I looked at the province of Luanda as the capital city. It's one of my case study win in Angola, just because of its diversity politically, and also because of its ethnic diversity. The other province is the province of Bengo in northern Angola. It's mostly dominated by the MPLA ruling party, and ethnically it's dominated by the Kimbundu ethnic group, and there is a slight presence of the Kikongo ethnic group as well. And then in the south, you have the province of Benguela, which is much more diverse, just like Luanda, politically diverse. Ethnically, it's comprises by the Ovimbundu ethnic group, which is the largest ethnic group in Angola. And then in the north, I have the province of Malange, which is equally dominated by the MPLA, and ethnically, it's dominated by the Kimbundu, but there is some diversity as well, some minority ethnic groups in this province. But then there is a 5th province, which is the province of Lunda North in eastern part of the country. It's MPLA has a significant presence there, but there is also the PRS in the province. And in terms of ethnicity, the Soque ethnic group dominate. So this gives you, a little bit of variation in terms of ethnicity and political composition, and as well as regions. So in 1992, before the election, before the general election, when the 2 belligerents, which is the government of Angola and UNITA, the rebel group at the time, decided to cease fire and organize election for the first time. The MPLA ruling party decided to deliver services directly to the population, specifically housing to its supporters, and so the opposition were basically excluded in the 5 countries. And so the idea was to deliver these services before the election so that they could build social capital and build legitimacy and basically gain the support of the population before the election. And electricity was often delivered to mostly to the urban areas where the elites lived. And as far as the slum areas, electricity was delivered in shifts, often from 5 to 6 and 6 to 5 a.m. in the morning in a different neighborhood. And the opposition stronghold was excluded, especially after the election, because the ruling party was able to learn the neighborhoods that voted for the opposition, and therefore they were totally excluded from electricity access. So they relied on private suppliers. As far as water, the regime basically just provided water tap water to the urban elites, and as far as the people in the slums, they relied on public sandpipes. Rural dwellers were excluded and basically relied on unclean water from the rivers or dig wells in their backyard. And again, the opposition was excluded as far as water access. Regarding healthcare, the regime delivered services, built hospitals, like big hospitals, well-equipped, relatively well-equipped in the cities, and in the slums, they just relied on small healthcare centers. And therefore, because of lack of robust healthcare system, people often relied on African herbs to treat themselves, and the elites would usually travel overseas for treatment. And as far as education, it was quite the same. The urban areas enjoyed quite significant services, while the slums, not so much, and the rural totally neglected. So In 1996, the war got worse. It intensified because the rebels didn't accept the results, and so the country had gone into war again in 1992, and in 1996 the war escalated. And because of the escalation of the war, people abandoned the villages, and so as a result, we had a high level of urban concentration, and therefore the government didn't have sufficient employment for everyone, and people resorted to informal economies, namely open air markets, to be able to make a living. So this also had a repercussion on the services that the provinces were able to deliver. They couldn't deliver services to everyone, and therefore civil society actors such as churches started to repudiate bad governance in the country. Therefore, the unpopularity of the President dos Santos at the time escalated, and so he decided to take 3 different actions in order to mitigate the issue and continue to sustain its legitimacy and its regime. So one of the things that he did was to fire immediately his own prime minister, not just fired him, but shamed him, holding him responsible for the failures of the government. Second of all, he sidelined international NGOs, especially those who were critical of the regime. And the second step that he took was to create his own civil society. He created his own civil society and also demanded that churches and corporations, especially those operating in the sector of oil and diamond, to also help provide services to the population. So here it is a table on how services were provided by proxies. For instance, when it comes to housing, churches didn't provide any housing except shelter for the orphans. They didn't really build houses for the people, and the same is true for the NGOs that were created by the government. As you can see here, a list of NGOs that were created by the government of Angola. Neither the oil or diamond companies provided housing or electricity, except the diamond companies that operated in the province of Lunda North, which is a diamond-rich provinces. They were able to provide electricity to those people through industrial generators. So basically, the proxies, these churches and NGOs, as well as oil and diamond companies, provided just focus on providing water, especially public standpipes. And also healthcare, through the construction of healthcare centers in the slums, and as well as building schools that helped supplemented the schools that were built by the government. And I just wanted to point out as well that in terms of education, those companies, the multinational corporations, sent quite a significant number of Angolans overseas to be able to study and also help their own project in Angola, because oil and diamonds are very high-tech industries, and therefore they needed quality people to be able to sustain their own operation on the ground. In conclusion, the state was institutionally weak because it couldn't provide sufficient services to the people nationwide. Therefore, it strategically sidelined critical NGOs and created its own NGOs, as well as made a big compromise in terms of encouraging the development of a parallel state, allowing the churches to deliver services that were supposed to be delivered by the government itself, and also allowing international corporations to deliver those services. And these services should be the responsibility of the states, not of those corporations. So the state wittingly promoted the development of a parallel state. So this is not a typical position for a hegemonic party state, as they usually want to have all of the actors under control. So, but the government of Angola at the time was able to, allow other actors to be able to supply services that it should be supplied by itself. So basically, in the Soviet jargon, party states are not usually comfortable to share power with actors that are not part of the nomenclatura. So the churches and corporations played a big role in terms of providing services and mitigating the suffering of the population, but they unwittingly ended up also sustaining authoritarian rule. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Appreciate it. So our next presenter, and as I mentioned at the start, we will take questions at the end for both presenters. So our next presenter is going to be Elijah Eshun, also from Western Michigan University, speaking on searching for IMF externalities in Africa, the case of water and sanitation in West Africa. So Elijah, if you'd like to share your screen, perfect. I'll turn it over to you. Oh, Elijah, you are muted. So you might want to unmute first, please.
Okay. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. My topic is, as the chair mentioned, let me project first, sorry about that. Okay, so searching for IMF externalities in Africa, the case of water and sanitation in West Africa. A little background, and for the purposes of our discussion today, IMF refers to the International Monetary Fund, funded at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Its main activities include training experts, researching, collecting data, and most important of all, lending programs and loans to countries in economic crisis. In return for IMF policies and programs, countries that may enroll may consent to implement a list of obligatory policy reforms, commonly known as the IMF conditionalities. The IMF became popular in Africa in the early 1980s when the continent was hit by economic crisis. And as it may not surprise most of us, most parts of the world today continue to face water and sanitation challenge. When you look at the data on Africa, as of 2015, about 584 million people in Africa didn't have access to clean water and sanitation. And out of that, 231 million people practice open defecation. Now, even when you look at West Africa, the countries that you can characterize as having water coverage, best water coverage, as many as 1 in 4 people still lack adequate water and sanitation. And as it were, the rural folks suffer this challenge more than the urban resident. Now, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goal number 6, it is estimated that by 2030, we're supposed to achieve universal and sanitation coverage for the whole population. Now we are left with only about a decade to hit 2030. And if I'm not being a prophet of doom on the face of the statistics, it looks like most African or West African countries will be unable to achieve their goal. And the question remains why? And this leads me to the problem statement of my study. It reads, coexisting with inadequate water coverage and sanitation challenge in West Africa is insufficient budget allocation, lack of capital investment, and recruit in the water and sanitation subsector. My objectives today, I seek to investigate the ways by which the IMF conditionalities affect water and sanitation expenditure in West Africa, and then establish the relationship between IMF conditionalities and government social expenditure. More specifically, I ask the following question. Do IMF conditionalities impact government water and sanitation expenditure? And 2, what is the relationship between IMF conditionalities and government social expenditure in West Africa? Now, when you look at existing theory, existing literature, it can be categorized into two broad frameworks. We have those who support the IMF programs and conditionalities, and those who normally critique the IMF conditionalities. Those who are in support argue that in the medium to long term, IMF policies leads to economic development and sustainability. Those who critique the IMF programs argue that either by design or by omission, IMF policies and programs leads to social, collateral social damage to participating countries. That is, they are unable to reap the intended benefit. And so in this study, I seek to test the critics' view with empirical evidence. And so my research is a qualitative. I don't use any quantitative measure, and it's a case study approach. The number of countries included, it includes 16 West African countries, and I studied them for a period of 18 years. Of course, data availability informed my choices of the countries, and the countries selected here, each of them must have enrolled in IMF program. I do thematic analysis, that is, I categorize them into topics. And so my archival research or search identified 3 pathways through which government expenditure or IMF policies or conditionalities can be linked to expenditure on water and sanitation in West Africa. The first one is water and sanitation budget execution. That looks at the public-private partnership. It looks at and what have you. It's like at the condition for augmenting minimum expenditure for water and sanitation. And the last one, we have the wage and recruitment caps. Okay, and so what this study does is that I identified the topmost strategies which the country used to tackle water and sanitation challenge, and I placed that against the IMF conditionality demand, and then I look at its effect. Now, when you look at all the countries that I study, one of their topmost strategy to tackle water and sanitation challenge was to acquire new water plants, sanitation plants, and maintaining old ones. Now, when they enroll in IMF program, one of the conditionality was to achieve fiscal discipline by cutting social expenditure. Now, IMF was concerned about the public rising debt of these countries. So IMF recommended that these countries reduce their social spending. When it happens this way, water and sanitation demand is being crowded out as countries will be willing to sacrifice this quote unquote less important sector for very pressing ones such as education and health. Now, with respect to recruitment and increase of wages was another strategy to tackle water and sanitation. But then the IMF demanded that caps should be placed on recruitment and wages. That is, you don't recruit new people and then you don't increase their wages. And this led to high employee turnovers, and then there were loss of skilled labor in the water and sanitation subsector. In fact, my evidence revealed that an engineer working in the energy sector was earning as twice as the person working in the water and sanitation subsector. And then the last strategy that the country intended to use was high state control with low private sector participation. IMF demanded that they decentralize and have high private sector participation. This created governance problems. It created bottlenecks and delay of the implementation of water and sanitation policies. And one thing, it's also the well-endowed district with resources were able to implement their policies, but the districts that were less endowed could not implement their policies. So in conclusion, my findings confirm the views of the critics that either by design or by omission, IMF conditionalities result in it forces government to reduce their expenditure on critical areas such as water and sanitation. By way of limitation of the study, this study does not take into account changes in population, and it's mainly to look at how the dynamics of our population changes and all of that could affect the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable used by this study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elijah. You can end sharing your screen, then we'll be able to potentially see the people who are asking the questions. So as I mentioned at the start, at this time, we'll take questions for both of our presenters. If you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. If you move your cursor over the screen, a reaction button will show up at the bottom right, and that'll allow you to raise your hand, and then I'll ask for your question. We just have to give a few minutes for people to warm up. Oh, Dr. Clark, and hopefully no one minds if I call you by the name. So I just say someone can say, hey, John, go ahead and ask your question.
I'm happy to ask my question, Melissa. So my question for each of you is a little bit less about what you studied in the past and a little bit more about moving forward. I know only a little bit about this stuff from, you know, sort of a vague New York Times level of understanding, but I've certainly read about the ways in which China has tried to make inroads into Africa, particularly as a way to access resources and to withdraw resources. But I'm curious in the two areas of service provision that, or in the areas of service provision in the two sort of regionally and specifically in Angola, is China playing a presence now in those places, and what's the upside, what's the downside for the people of the region, and how might that differ from U.S. interests or other interests? Manuel, you're muted.
After the end of the Civil War in 2002, the government of Angola had the need to engage in national reconstruction. And so China has been playing a big role in the reconstruction of Angola. And they have invested quite significantly in the building of water facilities and electricity facilities, as well as housing. There are actually now many housing developments in different provinces of Angola as a result of the deal between the Angolan government and China. So this is a deal that is commonly known as oil for infrastructure model, where basically the Angolan government provides oil to China in exchange for infrastructure. So the biggest downside of it, you know, the criticism about this model is the fact that 60%, for instance, right now 60% of the Angolan oil output goes to China. So even though we produce, you know, slightly over 1 million barrels of oil per day, most of oil has been sold already, and this has been really difficult for the country, especially in terms of managing the budget for other social projects that the country is in need right now. So that's one thing. And the other thing about this deal is that there is a tremendous, at least until recently, a tremendous presence of Chinese in the country, and, you know, in the participation of this infrastructure. And this has actually received a lot of criticism because it doesn't help mitigate unemployment among the local Angolans. And of course, there is another issue, which is the issue of quality. You know, many of the infrastructure that have been built by the Chinese so far Some of them have actually disappeared already. They don't exist. For instance, the roads. So the quality of the infrastructure has been another area of criticism. But there is some areas where China receives quite a lot of praise, and this is the area of politics. So basically, the argument is that the Chinese don't mix politics with business. They don't care so much about whether the country is concerned about human rights or transparency. They just want to do business. So that's one of the for those who advocate for this kind of partnership, they say this is positive, because China doesn't really interfere in the internal politics of Angola. Number one. Number two, in terms of paying back the loan. So it's a long-term payment, period, which gives kind of a little leeway for the Angolan government to be able to do other things. So now you asked, how the U.S. would participate in this, or how does it impact the U.S. presence in Angola? The U.S. actually, and other Western countries in general, they haven't been so much focused on the construction of infrastructure. So their most concern has been in the oil and gas industry. That has been the focus traditionally. But I don't know, probably with the Biden's administration, Build Back a Better World, the situation may change. We can probably see the U.S. investing more on infrastructure development in Africa, and be a little bit, I wouldn't say be away from the traditional sector, but I can see the U.S. Down the road moving more, U.S. and Western allies on the ground moving more towards the construction of infrastructure as well.
Elijah, would you like to weigh in on the question as well?
Yeah, just a few to what my co-presenter has just said. In area of sanitation and water, one thing China has been critiqued for is their involvement in the mining sector in Africa, and the disregard for the environmental protocols. I remember in Ghana last year, there was a near study, Chinese embassy and some Ghanaian locals, because China has been engaging in illegal mining, gold mining. In our local language, we call it the galamsey, and that has been deteriorating the environment and polluting water bodies. And people have argued that that's not what that mining activity initially was reserved for local people, but then due to corruption and all of that, the Chinese people find their way in there, and people are like, this is against diplomacy. If you are engaging other country, you are not supposed, you have to respect about the diplomatic calls and all the rules in investing in the various sectors of the economy. But then China has, as it were, disregard all of that and engage in an activity that people would like to describe as illegal, aside even polluting the environment and all of that. That notwithstanding, China has also invested tremendously in other sectors, like in Nigeria, for instance, their biggest water plant was funded by the Chinese. And then if you juxtapose that against their activities, which include polluting the water and all of that, I mean, it's problematic. So I don't really think China is helping Africa much in terms of sanitation and water, when collectively their activities are being put together, because it's like they fund less and then they are causing more harm than good. That's what I will add to what my co-presenter said.
Thank you. Other questions? while our audience is warming up to their question, I have, just a really easy softball question for both of you. So we have two examples of things that are not working particularly well. In one case, in Angola, where you have other outside groups unwittingly propping up an authoritarian regime and service provision. And then in another case, in these countries where the IMF conditionalities aren't working. So how would you solve these situations?
Please, can you repeat your question?
Yes. So the end of it really was, how would you solve the situation you detailed? I guess an easy.
Well, and in the case of Angola, I think it is fundamental that we start building a robust civil society in order to be able to put pressure on the government to be held accountable, for its actions, because it's not acceptable that in the context of democracy, these kind of situations happen. So again, my analysis focused on the time, during the time of the Civil War, but as the Civil War ended, the country is a little bit more open. There is a little bit more scrutiny, both from local civil society organizations and also from the international community. So I do believe that this is the way that we should continue going, allowing civil society organizations to become more and more robust, accessing the resources that they need in order to hold the government accountable, and of course that we need educated people so that they can be able to understand what their citizenship rights are, and understand that they are actually the bosses, and therefore the government needs to answer to the people. So that's I think some of the issues, some of the strategies that could be implemented in order to mitigate this kind of issues.
Yeah. With respect to the IMF conditions, I would argue they would need to take a second look at the conditionalities and then allow the home countries to come out with homegrown policies, especially when they are operating from the outside, focus on fiscal discipline and economic development. And one way they have been very serious with that to achieve economic development and growth is to cut social expenditure. There is no other alternative to that. And so I think one of the ways to resolve this is by allowing the countries some flexibilities, especially in critical areas such as water and sanitation, to allow them invest and recruit to deliver this critical service to the people.
Thank you. We'll do one last call for questions. If anyone in the audience has a burning question that they've been waiting for the right moment to ask. All right, Stuart, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm a classmate of Elijah's, and I just want to ask a quick question of both of you. So I know Professor Clark mentioned the idea that how China has gotten involved in West Africa. I got curious about, are there any other countries, any other priorities right now trying to get involved in whether it's Angola or Ghana beyond just the Chinese or the Americans or the IMF? Are there any other potential parties that are trying to either help or they're making the situation worse, such as other European countries, other Eastern countries? Just a little open mind question, but yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, in the case of Angola, we have had the presence of the Portuguese in terms of the construction of infrastructure, for example, roads. They have been quite present there, and they have also built other facilities such as hospitals and schools. But other than that, as I said previously, these are not areas where there is a massive presence of Western countries, except Portugal and Brazil. Brazil has also been quite influential, in terms of the infrastructure sector, and also Israel. Actually, Israel has invested a lot in the construction of housing developments in Angola as well. But other than that, if you compare it to the top, influential Western countries such as the United States or France or Germany, the UK, they have focused more on the oil industry, through BP, Chevron, Exxon. So that's where they have the most influence as far as Angola.
Okay.
But as I said, with the meeting of Joe Biden recently, the G7 meeting recently in Europe, they have recognized that there is a need to diversify their presence in the developing world, not just in Africa, but in the developing world, in order to basically compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is an initiative of that focuses on constructing infrastructure facilities all over the world, particularly in the developing countries. So I think that if these policies are implemented, then we may see a much more robust presence of Western countries when it comes to the implementation and construction of facilities and infrastructure in Angola and elsewhere.
Okay. What I will add to that is, before any country goes to IMF, it must be in economic crisis or debt distress. And one thing China is doing lately is to give a lot of interest-free loans to African countries, which they don't have the capacity to pay. So sooner than later, the countries will realize that they are debt distressed and they will go to IMF, and these conditionalities come in, which result in massive reduction in social expenditure. So I would say the interest-free loans and all of that from China contribute to many of these countries going to IMF and suffering these consequences. In effect, then I would argue China is actually making the situation worse by making a lot of loans available for these countries without any checks and restraint. And so if China could also take a second look at its methodology of giving loans to this underdeveloped country, I think that will help them to ensure fiscal discipline in the first place, so that they may not be economically distressed and go to the IMF to suffer these consequences.
Okay, thank you. Don't see any other hands being raised for questions. So at this point, I think we can give our two presenters a break and let them off the hook for a while. If you would like to do a virtual applause, if you go back down to that reactions button, you can see there's some applaud button there. So if we could give a virtual round of applause to our presenters today, we really appreciate that you presented your papers and we're willing to answer the questions that we had for you. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us for this panel. We have other panels coming up today, so consult your schedule and see what else you can tune in for. Maybe I'll see you at a later panel. Good night, everybody.